most of the men who went away to war returned by the millions sooner than most people had expected. Separation centers worked overtime, processing 750,000 men each month. In less than a year, the armed forces returned more than 12 million young men to civilian life. The GI Bill, with its financial and educational benefits, gave millions of veterans a chance to advance into the middle class. A great many seized the opportunity. Most veterans were anxious to put the war behind them. They collected $3 billion in mustering out pay and went looking for civilian jobs. At the employment offices, veterans got preferential treatment. They were the nation's heroes, after all. And there were low-cost home loans for veterans and low-interest loans to help them buy a farm or start a business. And many did just that. 2,230,000 veterans went to college on the GI Bill. For these pragmatic children of the Depression, a college degree was a ticket to the affluent middle class. It had been a costly war, almost 300,000 Americans dead. More than 670,000 were wounded, many of them permanently disabled. It had been a long, long time since Americans had been free to buy anything they wanted, but now the war was over. Cars, radios, cordless electric irons, consumer goods of all kinds were coming off the assembly lines. The Great Depression was just a memory. Most Americans had prospered during the war. They had money now, and they were eager to spend it. Millions of returning veterans got married. That created a demand for new houses and new kitchen appliances. Rationing had ended, food was plentiful. Overnight, it seemed, traditionally frugal Americans became conspicuous consumers. Nylons filled the shop windows, and real rubber tires rolled out of the factories for the new cars coming off the reconverted assembly lines. Americans climbed back into their automobiles. With light hearts and no road maps, they headed off into a materialistic world of the future, never to return.
Previously, we saw that Hollywood was founded by a small group of European immigrants who wanted a better life for all. These movie moguls numbered only about 20, but they founded 5 major studios and 4 mini-major studios between 1912 and 1935.
The original major studios that were formed in Hollywood were Paramount Pictures, RKO, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Warner Brothers, and 20th Century Fox. Believe it or not, Universal Studios used to be considered a mini-major. So the mini-majors were Universal Studios, United Artists, and Columbia Pictures. There were also some minor studios, and those minor studios were Disney, Monogram, and Republic.
With the formation of these studios, Hollywood grew and prospered beyond imagination. And as the studios prospered, actors, writers, filmmakers, and people from every vocation flocked into Hollywood to get a job in the talkies. And they did. It was the studio system, a vast industrial complex of vertically integrated motion picture production, distribution, and exhibition entities.
The studio system was basically a factory for motion pictures. It was put together by the original movie moguls, and they built a dream factory whereby they created an assembly line type process of making motion pictures. Hundreds of them a year, each studio, and the appetite across the country was insatiable.
As glamorous as the film business may seem to many people, the studio system is a business, and these studios are run with precision, and they're power-based, not unlike Wall Street or any other they are corporations. So the studio system, for instance, when I was placed under contract at 20th Century Fox, I was a member of a family, a proud member, and they did go to extreme lengths to keep us happy.
The studio system ensured that all the actors, writers, directors, producers were pretty much employed from picture to picture, so they were able to focus on their art rather than on money in the ad hoc system like we have today.
By the mid-1930s, the studio system had spawned over 17,000 movie theaters across the nation, and 60 million of the nation's 130 million people went to the movies every week. It was the golden age of Hollywood. Yes, even millionaires like Joseph Kennedy and Howard Hughes caught the movie bug. Everyone wanted to produce movies and tell their unique stories. Known as the Paramount Case, the first blow was in 1938 when the Justice Department sued the 5 major studios and ordered them to stop block booking and blind bidding.
Basic idea of the Paramount Case was that the big studios were engaged in monopolistic practices involving distribution of films, involving control over theaters, and what the Supreme Court was looking into was the set of practices that the studios were engaged in. Were these practices creating monopolies, or were they tending to create monopolies?
Block booking is forcing theater owners to buy packages of movies containing mediocre films in order to get the hit films.
Block booking is really no different than what we have today called bundling. In other words, they bundle cable with internet, with telephone, and they call it bundle. Now, maybe you're not forced to take all 3 of those things, but 50 channels and you really only want 1 cable channel or 5 cable channels, and yet you're forced to take all these other ones. You can't pick your channels a la carte in any kind of a competitive manner where the channels would compete with each other. You basically have to take the whole package of channels. If you wanted Gone with the Wind, you had to take Angry Red Planet or a bunch of other movies that you really didn't want to watch.
Blind bidding is forcing theaters to buy these same packages sight unseen. The suit was partially resolved in 1940 with a consent decree, which allowed the government to reinstate the suit if the studios didn't comply. Unfortunately, the studios did not comply, and in 1943 the case went back to trial and was appealed all the way to the Supreme Court by 1948.
The Supreme Court was looking into the question of whether vertical integration between the producers of movies and the distributors of movies, the exhibitors of movies, if you will, the theaters, were creating a monopoly situation.
Here, the High Court affirmed most of the consent decree's terms, but also ordered the movie moguls to sell their theaters. This single action by the U.S. government, known as divestiture, destroyed the Hollywood studio system and thus ended the golden age of Hollywood. Since the studios were never again able to reliably sell their product, they were never again able to reliably contract talented new writers, actors, directors, producers, or production crews with steady employment. The movie moguls had their theaters, their showrooms, chopped off in the name of the evils of vertical integration. Edison and Ford, on the other hand, still had their showrooms for their products, their record players and automobiles. Even though the 1940s saw some great movies, The Philadelphia Story, Fantasia, Grapes of Wrath, Citizen Kane, Casablanca, It's a Wonderful Life, 12 O'Clock High, the Hollywood studios were headed for still more icebergs. After World War II, television burst upon the scene, and by 1950, this new invention fostered a serious drop in movie ticket sales.
Television took a lot of people out of theaters and left them sitting at home watching television. The feature film, was still the bailiwick of the film of the theater. But after the introduction of television, there were less short films and other non-feature works that were done in Hollywood to be exhibited in theaters.
The movie moguls reacted by circling the wagons and initiating massive liquidations. First, they sold off their priceless collections of props and wardrobes from 50 years of movies that had changed Americans forever. Then they sold off their real estate. Back lots where movies like Sunset Boulevard, High Noon, White Christmas, Oklahoma, Bridge on the River Kwai, and Ben-Hur were filmed. Add to these sad events the escalating massive unemployment due to the breakup of the studio system, and Hollywood talent, staff, and crews were desperate.
Hollywood was determined to keep the image of its stars intact. Having a marketable image led some stars to fame and fortune, but keeping up appearances demanded a lot from them. Let's look at the rules old Hollywood stars had to follow. As the Roaring '20s kicked off and movie studios flocked to Hollywood, they released their talent scouts into the wild, searching for fresh faces to turn into stars. They would then contract these aspiring actors for years. All of this was done to protect a major studio's economic interests. These contracts meant an actor would only work with a single studio, locking them down for years. In the beginning, it seemed that these stars were handsomely paid. Some stars even made as much as $5,000 a week. But as an actor's popularity grew, their salary didn't rise, and that was all thanks to the contracts put in place. It wasn't just actors who were placed under contract. Nobody was exempt.
You're under contract, you're going to stay that way. Anything you write is going to be the property of Capitol Pictures, and Capitol Pictures is not going to produce anything you write.
Even directors, writers, producers, cinematographers, art directors, and technicians were asked to sign on a dotted line. This practice made everything in the production stage that much easier, even if it meant that some of the props and sets were a bit more inferior than they could have been. What do Judy Garland, Marilyn Monroe, and Natalie Wood all have in common? Their legendary A-list names were all created by the studios that built them into the stars they're remembered as today. During the time of Hollywood's golden age, it was standard practice for an actor's name to be changed, and the reasons were endless. While Gilda lead Rita Hayworth was viewed as an all-American bombshell, her birth name was Margarita Casino. Her father was Spanish, while her mother was Irish-American. Forced to change her name to appear more Anglo-sounding, her transformation completely whitewashed her ethnicity. Louis B. Mayer, co-founder of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios, once declared, "A star is made, created, carefully and cold-bloodedly built up from nothing." Sure enough, that's precisely what Hollywood was doing during its golden age. The iconic producer noted that all he initially looked for in a future star was their face and if they could look good on camera. In his opinion, he could do the rest. Sure enough, future A-listers had to be willing to change their appearance, and sometimes their entire image. Along with changing her original Hispanic last name, Rita Hayworth also went through a rigorous physical change. She was subject to years of electrolysis to change her hairline. Others, such as Olivia de Havilland of Gone with the Wind fame, didn't have the same luck. De Havilland, who signed with Warner Brothers in 1935, was sick of the one-dimensional roles she was repeatedly forced to play and began declining parts the studio thrust upon her. The punishment? De Havilland was essentially blacklisted from the industry, with Warner Brothers even going so far as to tell other studios not to hire her. Being locked into long-term contracts with their studios, actors had virtually no say when it came to whatever roles were assigned to them. While many stars were unwilling to go against the system, Olivia de Havilland boldly decided to rebel against Warner Brothers, making a legendary change to the Hollywood system. In an interview, de Havilland said, "What bothered me was playing one-dimensional parts in films. Those roles were intended simply to fill the routine function of the girl." As such, the A-lister began declining roles and found herself basically suspended from the studio without pay. De Havilland didn't have an on-screen role for almost 2 years during the prime of her career. Yet de Havilland was relentless, and with the knowledge that her lawyer father gave her, she took Warner Brothers to court and won. The result was the de Havilland Law, a 7-year rule on contracts that ultimately helped destroy the old studio system. The golden age of Hollywood churned out movies at a meteoric rate. Over 7,500 feature films were made by studios between 1930 and 1945. Of course, to produce that many features, actors were pushed to the brink of exhaustion, since there was no limit put in place on how much a star could work. The solution that studios used to keep their A-listers working was simple: feed them pills. As 20th Century Fox Dr. Lee Siegel explained in Goddess, The Secret Lives of Marilyn Monroe, it was the norm to use pills as a tool to keep stars working, adding that by the early 50s, everyone was using pills. While the movies made during Hollywood's golden age were filled with glitz and glam and A-listers swooning for one another, behind the scenes, a fairy tale ending wasn't that easy to come by. It turns out, studios had a lot of say when it came to an actor's love life. When Boys Town star Mickey Rooney went to MGM and declared he was going to marry Ava Gardner in 1952, studio head Louis B. Mayer bluntly forbade it.
I think we're just pals who might be something more sometime in the future. You gotta ask Mr. Mayer. I think it's just pals.
Although Rooney was eventually allowed a very private wedding, others weren't as lucky. According to Scandals of Classic Hollywood, there was a rumor that Jean Harlow couldn't marry William Powell because MGM had written a clause into her contract that said she could never get married. For gay actors, it was even more challenging. Studios would arrange marriages between gay, lesbian, and bisexual actors to hide their actual sexual orientation.
When crafting a story, one of the first things a filmmaker has to decide is what genre does their story fit into. Genre is an important aspect of storytelling. It's a way to let your audience know what to expect, and sometimes surprise them.
Okay, did not see that coming.
Today we will explore many kinds of genres. What sets them apart? And how are they similar? This is What is Genre? But before we get started, subscribe and click the bell for more filmmaking videos. Spoiler alert for the following movies. Ready?
Teach me.
In film, a genre is a category based on similarities, either in the plot, aesthetics, or the intended emotional response. The word genre comes from the French, which means kind or sort. The concept of genre can be traced back to Greek philosopher Plato, who believed there to be only two genres, poetry and drama. Since then, a multitude of genres have emerged, including horror, thriller, romance, and comedy. In fact, most genres can be further divided into more specific categories called subgenres. For example, subgenres within the action genre include martial arts, adventure, and of course, superhero films. So, now that we know what genre is, let's explore the purpose of genres and why they're so important in storytelling. Genre serves two purposes: to set up audience expectations and to provide a roadmap for storytellers. First, whether they're aware or not, audiences are well versed in genre rules. They are innately familiar with the patterns and characteristics of genre through a lifetime of watching movies. Horror movies are expected to frighten, while a comedy is expected to make the audience laugh.
It's terrible! She has beautiful eyes and her hair smells like cinnamon!
Failing to meet those expectations can create unsatisfied customers and disappointing box office returns. The second purpose for genre is to aid storytellers by providing a roadmap through which they can tell their stories. Just like a recipe has a list of ingredients, every genre has its own set of story beats, tropes, and aesthetics. If a writer follows the basic recipe, they will create something that fulfills audience expectations. This roadmap becomes clearer as we move from basic genres into more specific subgenres. Our only expectation from a crime film is that it will deal with criminal activity. This tells us very little about the characters, situations, themes, etc. But if we go a step down to the murder mystery subgenre, we have a lot more information about what to expect. We can guess the basic plot. A murder takes place. The structure: a detective interviews suspects and collects clues until they solve the mystery. We can even expect a specific type of scene, the big reveal of the murderer in the end.
Yeah, I killed Fran, but I guess I didn't. So what do you have on me? Nothing. What, attempted murder? I get arson for the building and a few other charges. With a good lawyer, which I have, I'll be out in no time.
Even if you're only vaguely familiar with film noir, you probably know a lot of its tropes.
Where had I gone wrong?
We need answers. See? I need to know who the jewel thief is. See?
Suppose you tell me about it from the very beginning.
Film noir is a catch-all term for the hard-boiled detective films of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, which often present us with an examination of the dark and lurid fantasies of a population on the verge of collective insanity. Early crime fiction, along with its screen adaptations that came later, torpedoed its audiences into the thrills and seductions of the criminal underworld and into nightmares of the surreal. Its archetypal characters and locations, along with iconic cinematic devices, have created a truly unique genre whose influence on filmmaking can still be seen to this day. It gave us the anti-hero, the femme fatale, the red herring, and countless other still utilized archetypes. In this video, I'll be picking apart and examining the many motifs found within film noir, as well as unpacking the ways that those motifs were a reaction to what was going on in the US, particularly in regards to the Great Depression and the American Dream. I'll be using specific films as reference points, so if you haven't seen any of the films listed in the description below, consider this your spoiler warning. The origins of the hard-boiled detective drama can be traced back to a fertile mixture of influences. These include US crime fiction of the hard-boiled variety, Hollywood gangster movies, German cinema of the Weimar years, and French poetic realist films of the immediate pre-war period. Though film noir does reflect significantly on this international influence, it was primarily the works of American authors such as Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, and James M. Cain that provided the paradigmatic characters, as well as most of the dialogue for future screenplays.
I've always credited the private detective with a high degree of omniscience.
Between 1941 and 1948, at least 1/5 of all film noirs were derived from hard-boiled crime fiction from the 30s. In analyzing these films as works of art, we must first understand the historical context of their time, the time in which the writer wrote them. In his book, the characters that appear in the numerous crime novels of the 1930s, as well as their screen counterparts, have become archetypes of the genre. The world-weary, quick-witted, embittered protagonist, often but not always a private eye, but sometimes a boxer, a gangster, a screenwriter, or a hitman, who is lured into the criminal underbelly, often by a beautiful but treacherous femme fatale.
I'm trying to find my sister.
I'm asking you not to.
I have to know.
Not now, Bill.
In a sense, these American detectives were a kind of repudiation of Holmesian-style English detectives, who were far more straight-laced and proper. Except for the cocaine and morphine. The detectives of the film noir era were far more biting and brooding.
You're drunk. Get out!
In his book Dangerous Men, Pre-Code Hollywood and the Birth of the Modern Man, author Mick Lassell points out that it was a male genre. The movies were invariably about unhappy men. Women suffered from being in their company, and sometimes suffered at their hands. But the men were the ones in torment. These men exhibit a certain moral ambivalence. Their dry humor and lightning-fast dialogue is reminiscent of the ruthless gangsters in Little Caesar and The Public Enemy.
You got me to take care of your husband for you. And then you get Sacchetti to take care of Lola. Maybe take care of me, too. Then somebody else would have come along to take care of Sacchetti for you. That's the way you operate, isn't it, baby?
Suppose it is. Is what you've got cooked up for tonight any better?
In voiceover narration, the detective will often ponder and question his own morality.
The joint looked like trouble, but that didn't bother me. Nothing bothered me. The 220s felt nice and snug against my appendix.
The location for these stories is almost always the claustrophobic urban jungle, usually Los Angeles, Chicago, or New York, as to express the insufferable alienation of city life. Billy Wilder's Double Indemnity begins with a cold open, as all crime noirs do. The action begins abruptly, with a screeching car speeding through an empty Los Angeles. The film employs the typical narrative device of framing the entire primary narrative as a flashback, spoken in reflection by the protagonist. The leading man is insurance salesman Walter Neff, an intelligent, hyper-observant shark type. He falls for the sultry Phyllis Diedrichson, and together they carry out the murder of Phyllis's rich, overinsured husband. At various points in the film, Walter's thoughts are spoken in voiceover narration as he examines the minute details of his surroundings.
So I let her have it straight between the eyes. She didn't fool me for a minute, not this time. I knew I had hold of a red-hot poker and the time to drop it was before it burned my hand off.
What?
I stopped at a drive-in for a bottle of beer, the one I had wanted all along.
Yeah.
Only I wanted it worse now.
The dialogue between Walter and his boss Keyes is sharp, fast, and witty. The textbook hard-boiled back and forth.
You delivered the policy to him personally, didn't you?
Yeah.
You got his check.
Sure I did.